The first thing I would say about the recovery is that it's very imbalanced. One of the things that was repeated over and over again for a number of months was this concept of the synchronized recovery, no? And that obviously has not happened. And I think that what we started seeing was that numerous Asian economies recovered much faster than what many anticipated. That was very evident that Latin America and the Eurozone lagged and continue to lag, and that the United States, which was interestingly enough supposed to recover slower than the Eurozone and than many of the developed economies, according to estimates, is actually recovering faster. So in general, what we can say is that we have a modest, we have a weak recovery, but the level of recovery is starting to pick some pace, and that we need to be very, very aware of the risks because it's a very indebted recovery. The level of deficit spending and the massive stimulus plans have elevated debt levels to around 3 times the GDP of the global economy. I think that it's also going to be very risky to continue to maintain those stimulus plans and those deficit spending programs for a prolonged period of time. But in general, what we can say is that about 90% of the world economy will have recovered the GDP of 2019 by 2022. And that the slowdown is obviously going to happen. We're going to have much lower rates of growth into 2022 and 2023 than what many would have hoped for.
Yeah, we'll pick up on central banks in just a little bit to get your views as to, what monetary policy is doing and where it may go. But staying a bit on the top level right now, in terms of the growth figures, the projections that we're seeing for next year, we've seen the likes of the European Commission say that the EU growth will be at around 4.3% in 2022 and then slowly dropping down in 2023. Now, there's still a lot of risk out there in the global economy, and I think you can't really expect an economy to perform exactly how it was doing in 2019 until we have most of these health risks out of the way. What do you think are the factors that we're seeing going into 22 that can determine this growth or can hinder this growth in terms of what are those risks that can really derail these projections going forward? What to look out for?
I think that what investors must be aware of is that most of these projections are based on an assumption of fiscal multipliers of government spending that have never happened. So it is absolutely normal to and advisable to at least start to think that such levels of growth are likely to be at least trimmed, because it's almost impossible to achieve the level of fiscal multipliers that international bodies are assuming to get to those levels of growth. I think that also the risk of inflation is very important. Inflation, even if it moderates into 2022, is a burden on consumption, is a burden on investment, and it's a burden on growth. No, so all in all, what we have to understand is that after a very indebted recovery and a very obviously weak recovery in the Eurozone, it is virtually impossible for these countries, due to the demographic effect, due to the indebtedness effect, and also because of productivity and the risk of inflation, to reach those estimates. However, that does not mean recession. And I think that that is the problem, is that when people like me talk about the need to revise down some of these very optimistic estimates, Many people think, wow, we're going into a crisis. No, we're going into normality. And I think that that's what we need to understand, is that prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the Eurozone, the fourth quarter of 2019, France was growing 0%. Italy was growing 0%. Germany was not growing either. So we need to understand that the factors that were driving the slowdown of the Eurozone prior to COVID-19 are where we are recovering into. We are recovering into those levels of low growth, high debt, and weak productivity growth.
Yeah, now I want to quickly pick up on when you were talking there about inflation, because towards the end of this year, a lot of what we've seen of these bottlenecks and disruption in global supply have caused inflation to soar. I mean, inflation in the Eurozone, in the US, 30-year highs. When we're looking at PPI data and CPI data, we're not necessarily seeing this stopping anytime soon. And it's also a question of how are companies going to be able to deal with these rise in producer prices? Are they then going to feed down to the end consumer towards 2022? Now, I think a word that's been floated around recently a lot is stagflation. And obviously the way inflation is going and the potential for growth to be hindered, and even more now that we still have doubts about what this new variant of COVID-19 is and how it's going to affect global economies. Are we meant to be fearing of stagflation? Is it something that we need to look out for? And what would it mean ultimately for the economy, this period of stagflation?
Stagflation is a risk. It is not something that we can discount as a base case right now, because there are a number of disinflationary factors that will work through the economy. But stagflation is an important risk that we should not rule out, because it has been something that many people like myself have lived in the past. So it's not something that is distant in our memory. I think that the problem that I at least find in the message of temporary inflation is that it comes from international bodies, central banks, and analysts that started the year saying that there was absolutely no risk of inflation, actually that there was risk of disinflation. Then they said that inflationary pressures were due to the base effect. When the base effect was gone, they said it was going to be largely temporary. Now they say that it has some risks of being more permanent. Ultimately, it's like a big vessel that even if you decide to stop, it continues to go. No, so the risk that you mentioned is the most important one. Is I think that this massive increase in PPIs, the massive increase in costs for producers are going to feed through the final prices at some point, and not too distant, unfortunately, and that is likely to keep inflation elevated, even considering some of those disinflationary factors that may happen if some of the supply chains are improved. But ultimately, the point is the following. If central banks are going to continue to pump liquidity into the economy, and that liquidity goes to massive stimulus plans that are fully directed to energy-intensive and construction-intensive programs, inflation will remain for a more prolonged period of time than we would like.
Right, let's bring it now to central banks. And I feel like there's two topics that I want to discuss here. I think before we look at what's currently going on and what to look out for in the new year, I want to get your views quickly on how central banks have been deploying quantitative easing. Now, in your book, Escape from the Central Bank Trap, you were talking about how QE has become way too conventional, and rather than aiding the economy, it can actually create a greater separation of wealth and distribution within the economy. Now, seeing how the recession that we've seen, or how 2020, the reaction in the global economy wasn't so much a recession that was brought on. Yes, we had slowing growth in 2019, as you were saying, and economies were already showing signs of fatigue. Germany was a key example of that. I feel like in 2020, what we saw, that that very rapid drop off in growth also had to do with the fact that it wasn't people not having the capabilities to spend, but more so not being able to go out and physically do it. Do you think that maybe central banks overreacted slightly in being so quick in lowering rates and pumping the economy with so much influx of capital and spending that in reality, maybe we didn't need it in that moment and we had to wait a little longer to see, what's going to happen out of this pandemic? Where is the economy sitting once we're able to actually go out and spend? And does the economy need that? I mean, do you have any views on how central banks reacted to this outbreak and could it have been different?
Way too aggressively. I fully agree. Way too aggressively, because you don't address a supply shock with demand policies. More importantly, the negative impact of demand side policies when what you're living is simply that a large part of the population is simply not being able to consume. It's not that they would, as you very well said, did not have the means or were suffering from a credit crunch or something like that. No, it was simply that we were all in lockdown. No, so think about this. In the middle of a lockdown, you massively increase money supply, and that money supply goes to government spending that is fully directed to spending on current levels of current items. No, so what happens is that once you open the economy, you've created a much larger bottleneck than would probably have existed anyhow in a just-in-time economy that has been shut down for a few months. So the problem is that central banks address the supply shock with massive demand side policies, therefore creating obviously a very booming equity and fixed income market, however, creating at the same time the roots of an inflationary pressure on goods and services that actually slows down the recovery. So to a certain extent, I had a discussion with Judy Shelton about this. She was saying that the recovery would have been a lot stronger without such a massive level of quantitative easing and stimulus packages. Not without them at all, which tends to be the mistake. People think, oh, doing nothing. No, but without this absolutely disproportionate demand side policy package in the middle of a lockdown.
Well, now we are where we are. We've seen this amount of stimulus in the economy. We're still with rates at ultra lows, a lot of capital flowing in the economy still. Now let's look ahead at what to expect in 2022. And we have seen some central banks start raising rates, and some are starting to pull back on that stimulus. We have the Federal Reserve talking about rate hike expectations in 2022, potentially seeing 3 rate hikes along the line. But I think one bank that stands out, and it's not a surprise to anyone, is the ECB. The ECB has long been considered one of the most dovish central banks out there. And we've seen the ECB struggle to recover from other periods of slowing growth and low rates back in 2015 and dragging along. So I think my question here is, do you think the ECB is doing the right thing in terms of keeping rates low and keeping the economy supported, seeing that the Eurozone has struggled to recover growth before? Or do you think that we should be focusing on the fact that there's too much stimulus in the economy and inflation is the real enemy here, and we should start to try and tame inflation before we can consider what's the playing field we're left with?
I think that the ECB is focusing its policy too much on maintaining a level of bond yields in sovereign issuers that is, excuse me, a level of bond yields for sovereign issuers that is absolutely disproportionately low for the reality of the economy. You cannot just focus monetary policy on keeping the bond yields of peripheral countries, of any of the Eurozone economies, at levels that are negative in nominal and sometimes real level. No, so I think that the problem of the ECB is that it's caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, inflation is soaring. It's hurting economies like Spain and Germany significantly because it's higher also in those than in the average of the Eurozone. While at the same time, if it stops the purchases or at least reduces them and increases rates, the impact on sovereign issuers is going to be very large, even from a very modest increase in bond yields. So no government in the Eurozone is right now able to tolerate an increase in bond yields. That is a huge problem because the ECB doesn't have tools to address inflation, and it doesn't have tools to address the risks of elevated valuations in housing, elevated levels of debt in risky assets, etc.
Great. And now just to finish off quickly, let's bring it into the labor market and the day-to-day economies of people. And we are seeing labor market recovery. We've seen it in the US. We're starting to see it in the Eurozone as well. But if you look at the participation rate, it's actually pretty stagnant, even dropping in some places. So yes, we have less unemployment. We have growing an improving labor market, but the people are dropping off. People actively looking for employment, or people that are actually in employment is dropping off. Now, that seems to be potentially tied in, I guess, maybe to inflation, the way it's eroding people's capabilities to keep up in terms of the purchasing power of consumers. Also, it's more expensive for businesses to keep operating. I just want to get your final view in what do you think is the picture of growth we're going to see in 2022? And I think this comes back to what you were saying earlier, this disparity in terms of growth, and it's going to be very uneven. What's your final takeaway of what to expect in 2022 in terms of global growth?
In 2022, we should expect China growing significantly less than estimated because the real estate situation is much more important, a lot more important actually than what many are assuming, particularly in some of the consensus estimates that we see. I think that the United States is also going to slow down its growth, but reach the levels of unemployment that it had prior to the pandemic, probably at the end of 2022. Labor participation rate is a big problem because there is an elevated number of people in developed economies that are simply unable to come back to the to work because inflation is too high. They cannot take their kids to daycare. They cannot. They need to have somebody that is taking care of other things. It's not easy. No, it's not easy. So the risk that I see is, I think that the biggest risks for 2022 come from China and the emerging economies, where the fiscal and monetary imbalances are very aggressive and can deliver a much steeper decline in the improvement of the economy. And I think that the Eurozone is on its path to its normal low levels of growth. But the United States is probably going to be able to deliver rates of growth and employment that are probably stronger than its peers. So in general, I would think that investors should count on lower growth, inflation to be prolonged for a longer period of time than was initially estimated, and elevated levels of debt to continue. And as such, central bank policy has to remain extremely accommodative. So I think that is the key factor, in my opinion. I don't think that we will see the rate hikes that have been announced, and there will probably be a lot less. And I don't think that central banks are going to reduce purchases of assets that significantly. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.